She dropped the spoon. Not because she was clumsy, not because her hands were shaking though they were. She dropped it because the man standing in the middle of that dusty street, the man who had written her 17 letters, the man who had signed his name beneath the words, "I will make you my wife," that man had just looked her in the eye in front of every soul in Dry Creek and said, "I never meant any of it." If what you're about to witness, a woman choosing dignity over despair, and a rancher who couldn't stop asking questions, if that's the kind of story that speaks to your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now and follow along until the very last word. And when you're done, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The stagecoach had pulled into Dry Creek just past noon, and the heat was the kind that didn't apologize. Abigail Turner was the last one off. She moved carefully down the iron steps, one hand gripping the rail, the other clutching the handle of a battered brown suitcase that had seen more hard roads than most men twice her age. She was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, full-figured, her dress worn clean, but faded at the collar, her boots resoled at least twice. She wasn't pretty the way the women in magazines were pretty. She was something quieter than that. Something that took a moment to see. She saw him right away. Gerald Marsh was standing near the post office with 3 other men, and when the stagecoach stopped, he straightened up and squinted in her direction. She recognized him from the photograph he'd sent. He was taller than she expected, better dressed, and for one brief, merciful second, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope. She walked toward him. The suitcase was heavy. The ground was uneven. She didn't ask for help. "Mr. Marsh," she said, stopping a few feet away. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't step forward. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he ordered from a catalog and finds disappointing when it arrives. "Miss Turner," he said. That was all. Just her name. Like a door closing. One of the men beside him, heavy-set, red-faced, wearing a vest 2 sizes too small, let out a short laugh. It wasn't loud, but it landed hard. Abigail set her suitcase down slowly. She kept her chin level. "I received your last letter on the 14th, she said. "You wrote that you would meet the noon stage. Here I am." Gerald Marsh shifted his weight. He glanced at his companions the way men do when they want a witness to whatever they're about to do. "I did write that," he said. "I'll grant you that much." "Then I'd appreciate it," Abigail said. "If we could speak privately before." "There's nothing private about it." His voice came out louder than it needed to. A few people on the boardwalk turned to look. "I think it's better if I just say this plainly. I made a mistake. I wrote those letters before I understood what I was, what the situation was. I'm a man of some standing in this town, and I have responsibilities to consider." Abigail didn't move. "What are you saying, Mr. Marsh?" It wasn't a question. She already knew. She had known maybe from the way he hadn't stepped forward. "I'm saying I can't go through with it." He said it firmly, the way men say things they've rehearsed. "I wrote to a woman I thought I made certain assumptions, and I see now that I was mistaken." The red-faced man coughed into his hand. Another one looked at his boots. The third one, the youngest, had the grace to look ashamed. "You made assumptions," Abigail repeated. About what you'd be like." "About my size," she said. He didn't deny it. That was almost worse. The street was quiet now in the particular way that small towns get quiet when something is happening that everyone will be talking about for the next 6 months. A woman near the dry goods store had stopped sweeping. A boy on a horse had slowed to a walk. Even the wind seemed to hold still. Abigail bent down and picked up her suitcase. Her fingers were steady. Her face was steady. Everything inside her was a different story, but she had learned a long time ago that you don't let the world see that. You especially don't let men like Gerald Marsh see that. "You spent 17 letters telling me about your ranch," she said quietly. "About your father's health. About how you hadn't eaten a proper meal since your housekeeper left. You told me you were a man who valued hard work and honesty." She paused. "I believed you. Now look, I'm not finished." Her voice was soft, but it stopped him cold. "I sold everything I owned to make this journey. I have $11.40 in my purse and a suitcase with 2 dresses in it. I didn't come here because I was desperate for a husband, Mr. Marsh. I came because you convinced me you were a decent man." She picked up her bag. "I'm grateful to find out the truth before, rather than after." She turned and walked away from him. She didn't know where she was going. There was a church at the far end of the street, and a hotel she couldn't afford, and a saloon she'd die before entering. She walked because standing still in front of those men was the one thing she refused to do. Behind her, she heard Gerald Marsh say something to his companions, and then she heard one of them laugh low and mean, and she heard the word heavy, and she kept walking. She made it to the water trough beside the livery stable before her legs decided they'd had enough. She sat down on the edge of it, set her suitcase between her feet, and stared at the ground. She didn't cry. She had made herself a promise years ago about crying in public, and she intended to keep it. But her hands were shaking now, and she couldn't stop them, so she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed slowly, and thought about what $11.40 could realistically do for a woman alone in a town where she knew no one. She was still sitting there when the shadow fell across her. She looked up. The man standing over her was lean in the way of men who work outside and all-weather dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a jaw that looked like it hadn't decided whether to be handsome or just weathered. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket and a hat that had been good once. He wasn't one of the men who had been standing with Gerald Marsh. She was certain of that because she had looked at all of them. He wasn't looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she noticed. He wasn't looking at her the way people looked at her after what had just happened, with that particular mixture of sympathy and discomfort that always made her feel like a problem someone needed to solve. He was looking at her the way people look at someone they're trying to figure out. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I'm fine," Abigail said before he could ask. "Didn't say you weren't." He crouched down so he wasn't looming over her, which was something she hadn't expected. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the street for a moment before looking back at her. "I have a ranch about 3 miles north of here," he said. "It's called the Broken Spur. My name is Nathan Brooks. My father lives with me, and he's not well, and since my housekeeper left in April, I haven't had a decent meal or a clean window in this house." Abigail looked at him. "Is that so?" "The work isn't easy," he said. "Cooking, cleaning, keeping the house in order. There's a room off the kitchen that's private. Meals are included, and there's a fair wage at the end of each week." "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a second. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that meant he was being careful with his words. "Because I saw what just happened," he said, "and because a woman who can walk away from that without once raising her voice or losing her dignity is exactly the kind of person I want working in my house." Abigail studied him. She had learned through a great deal of pain not to trust men who appeared suddenly with offers of help. She had learned that kindness could be a currency with a hidden price. She looked at his hands, calloused rough, the hands of a man who did actual work. She looked at his eyes steady, not searching, not calculating. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "I know you can cook. You told Marsh so in your letters. I heard him mention it to Bill Grady last week. And I know you didn't back down when you had every reason to." He stood up. "That's enough for me to start with." "It's temporary," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "For now," he said. "Until you find your footing. No strings on it." She sat with it for a moment. $11.40. 2 dresses. A town where the only person who knew her name had just used it to humiliate her in the street. "All right," she said. "I'll need to be paid at the end of the first week before I commit to the second." "That's fair." "And I don't work on Sundays afternoon." "Neither do I." She stood up, picked up her suitcase, and looked at him squarely. "My name is Abigail Turner. I cook, I clean, I don't complain, and I don't discuss my personal affairs. Is that acceptable?" Nathan Brooks looked at her for a moment with that same careful, unhurried expression. "Perfectly," he said. They walked to his wagon without another word. The drive out to the broken spur took just under an hour on a road, and neither did Abigail, and there was something almost restful about that. The land out here was wide and raw rolling grassland, broken by dry creek beds and the occasional stand of cottonwood. The sky was enormous in the way that frontier sky always was, the kind of sky that made a person feel very small and somehow strangely less alone. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill. It was a solid structure, 2 stories built of timber and stone, with a porch that ran the full length of the front. It had been well made once. The bones were still good, but the garden along the south side had gone to weeds, and one of the porch railings had split and never been replaced, and the windows had that gray film-covered look that came from months of being washed by nobody. A man was sitting on the porch. He was older, late 60s, maybe 70, with white hair and a face that had been eroded by years and grief into something gaunt and still. He watched the wagon pull up without standing, without changing his expression, without giving any indication that a visitor arriving at his home was of particular interest to him. "That's my father," Nathan said. "Walter. He doesn't talk much these days." "When did he stop?" Nathan was quiet for a second. "About a year after my mother died," he said. 3 years ago." Abigail climbed down from the wagon without assistance and looked up at the old man on the porch. He was watching her with pale, clear eyes that didn't hold cruelty and didn't hold warmth. They just held. She had met grief before and recognized it. "Mr. Brooks," she said, addressing the old man directly. "I'm Abigail Turner. I'll be keeping house and cooking. Is there anything you particularly like to eat?" Walter Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. "He's particular about his coffee," Nathan said behind her. "Then I'll learn how he takes it," Abigail said. She carried her own bag inside. The kitchen was the worst of it. Not filthy, Nathan had clearly been maintaining a basic level, but neglected in the way that spaces get neglected when no one who cares about them has been in them for a long time. The shelves were half-stocked in a haphazard way. There was a good iron stove that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The window above the sink looked out onto what had once been a productive kitchen garden and was now a tangle of dead vines and volunteer weeds. Abigail set her suitcase in the small room off the kitchen, hung her second dress on the hook behind the door, and went back out to take stock. She found dried beans in the pantry. She found potatoes and onions that were past their best but still usable. She found a cut of beef that Nathan had clearly purchased in town that morning hanging in the cool room. She found salt, pepper, dried thyme, and a small jar of what appeared to be bay leaves. She built the fire in the stove. She worked without thinking about Gerald Marsh, or the sound of that man laughing, or the word heavy, or the fact that she had $11.40 and no plan. She worked because working was the thing she knew how to do when everything else stopped making sense. She cubed the beef and browned it. She diced the onions and let them go soft in the fat. She added the potatoes, the beans, the herbs, and enough water to cover everything generously. She adjusted the heat and let it do what stew does, which is take a collection of ordinary, unremarkable things and turn them into something that smells like someone is home. She didn't hear Nathan come into the kitchen. She was standing at the stove when he stopped in the doorway, and she turned to find him looking at the pot with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't hunger exactly, though there was probably some of that. It was something older than hunger. "It'll be ready in another 20 minutes, she said. He nodded slowly. He didn't leave right away. He stood in the doorway, looking at the pot on the stove, and she understood, without his saying so, that the smell of something cooking on that stove was not a small thing in this house. "My mother used to make stew on the first hot day of summer," he said. He wasn't talking to her exactly. He was talking to the memory. Said it didn't matter how hot it was. First week of summer got stew. Abigail turned back to the pot and adjusted the lid. "Sounds like a practical woman," she said. She was. Dinner was quiet. Nathan sat at one end of the table, Walter at the other. Abigail served them and then stood at the kitchen counter to eat her own portion out of habit more than anything else in most houses she'd worked in. The help didn't sit at the family table. "Sit down, Miss Turner," Nathan said without looking up. She carried her bowl to the table and sat. Walter ate slowly, which was the first time she'd seen him do anything at all. He lifted each spoonful with deliberate care, and his jaw moved, and he didn't say anything. He got through most of his bowl. That, Nathan told her later with something quietly close to wonder in his voice, was more than he'd eaten at a sitting in 2 months. She washed the dishes after. She swept the kitchen floor. She banked the fire in the stove and checked the water level in the reservoir, and made note of what she would need from the store in town if she was going to run this kitchen properly. Then she went to her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and finally, silently in the complete privacy of 4 walls and a closed door, let herself shake for a little while. She let herself feel it, the full weight of the morning, of Gerald Marsh's face when he looked at her, of the laughter, of the words she'd heard. She let herself feel the ache of being 30 years old and starting over in a stranger's kitchen in a town where no one knew her name. She let herself feel all of it quietly and completely. Because she had learned that if you didn't let grief through the door, it came in through the window instead. Then she dried her face with the hem of her dress, straightened her back, and reached under the mattress to check that the small leather pouch she always kept there was still in place. Inside the pouch was a folded photograph, creased at the corners and soft at the edges from handling. She didn't take it out. She just pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt the shape of it beneath the ticking, and then she lay down and closed her eyes. In the kitchen, the smell of stew still lingered. Across the hall, through the thin walls of the ranch house, she heard Nathan Brooks sit down at what sounded like a writing table and heard the scratch of a pen on paper. And then, after a long while, she heard him stop. She heard him walk to the kitchen. She heard him lift the lid off the pot just briefly, just a second, and then she heard him put it back. She didn't know why a man would go back to an empty pot in an empty kitchen in the middle of the night. But she understood without words and without explanation that it had something to do with more than hunger. That it had something to do with a house that had been hollow for years, finally smelling, for the first time in a very long time, like someone was home. Nathan Brooks stood in that kitchen for a long while, and the question forming in his mind, quiet and persistent and strange, was not about the stew itself. Not exactly. It was about the way she had made it. He had eaten his mother's stew for 20 years. He had grown up with the smell of it, had learned to read the seasons by it, had known its particular character, the way a man knows the face of someone he loves. He knew the way it sat in the bowl, knew the color of the broth, knew the exact proportion of time to bay that made it something his mother's and not anyone else's. And tonight's stew, made by a woman he'd known for 6 hours, a woman who had arrived in his town that morning with a battered suitcase and no future. Tonight's stew had tasted in some way he could not explain and could not dismiss. Like exactly that. Like his mother's. Like something from his own kitchen. Like something that belonged here. He replaced the lid. He stood in the dark for another moment, listening to the silence of the house. A silence that was, for the first time in 3 years, a different kind of silence than usual. Not empty. Just quiet. He went back to his desk, picked up his pen, and wrote nothing. He sat with the question instead, the way you sit with something that doesn't have an answer yet, but that you know matters. Who exactly was Abigail Turner, and why would the stew she made in a kitchen she'd never set foot in before taste like a recipe no one outside one specific household should ever have known? The morning after Abigail's first night at the Broken Spur, Nathan was already at the barn before sunrise. She knew this because she heard the barn door creak open at 5:15, and by the time she had the stove lit and the coffee boiling, the sky outside the kitchen window had only just begun to gray at the edges. She had slept poorly, not because the bed was uncomfortable, which it was, but because her mind had refused to stop cataloging everything that needed doing in this house and everything she needed to remember not to say. Walter came down at 6:30. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, each one placed with care, the walk of a man whose body had gotten older faster than he was prepared for. She poured his coffee before he reached the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw the cup already waiting. "Milk," she said. "2 spoonfuls of sugar. Mr. Nathan mentioned it." Walter looked at the cup. Then he looked at her. He didn't say thank you. He sat down, pulled the cup toward him, and drank. She went back to the stove and started breakfast. She was cracking the fourth egg when he spoke. "You're not from here," Walter said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. He was stating the way old men sometimes state things, because the habit of keeping observations to themselves has finally worn out. "No, sir," she said. "I'm not. Where from?" "East of here," she said. "A ways." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been skepticism, and went back to his coffee. Nathan came in from the barn at 7 with mud on his boots and a preoccupied look on his face that suggested the morning had already given him problems. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the table, at the eggs, the biscuits she'd managed from the near-empty flour tin, the coffee already poured, and something shifted in his expression that he covered quickly by looking at his boots. "I'll need flour," Abigail said without turning from the stove. "And lard dried fruit if they have it, another sack of beans. I can make a list." "I go into town Saturdays," he said. "That's 4 days. I know when Saturday is, Miss Turner." She turned and looked at him. He had the grace to look faintly embarrassed. "I can make do until Saturday," she said. "I'm letting you know what I'll need, not asking you to go today." He sat down. He picked up his fork. He ate in silence for a moment, and then he said quieter, "The biscuits are good." "The flour is almost gone," she said. "Next batch won't be as light." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he put it away. Those first days settled into a rhythm that had its own particular texture. Abigail learned the house the way she always learned houses, not by asking questions, but by paying attention. She learned that Nathan left his coffee cup on the left side of the sink, never the right. She learned that Walter sat facing the window during meals, not because of the view, but because it was the direction his wife's chair had faced before she was gone. She found the chair itself in the parlor, pulled slightly away from the table, and never moved back, like someone had stood up and simply never returned to push it in. She pushed it in on her 3rd day. Walter watched her do it from the hallway. He didn't say anything. He went back upstairs. That evening at dinner, he sat in a different chair, one closer to the window where he could still see outside. Abigail set his coffee on the new side without comment. It was Nathan who noticed. He looked from his father to the rearranged chair and back to Abigail with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said to her that night in the kitchen when his father had gone up. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You did," he said. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, not coming in just there. He hasn't sat at that table without staring at her chair for 3 years. Abigail rinsed the last dish and set it on the draining board. "Grief needs a little rearranging sometimes," she said. "Not a lot, just enough to breathe." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn that?" She kept her back to him. "Experience," she said. She heard him push off the doorframe. She heard his footsteps cross the hall. She heard the click of his study door. She stood at the sink in the quiet kitchen and waited until she was sure he was gone before she let out the breath she'd been holding. The garden was the next thing. She had been eyeing it since the first morning, the wild tangle along the south wall that had once been, she could see by the structure of it, a serious kitchen garden. Raised beds. A proper trellis for climbing beans. Someone had put real thought and work into it once. She started on it during the hour after lunch when Walter napped and Nathan was out in the pastures. She didn't ask permission. She simply went out with the tools she found in the lean-to shed and began. The weeds came out in thick, root-heavy clumps. The soil beneath them was still good, dark, and friable, the kind of soil that had been tended for years before it was abandoned. She worked until her hands ached and then kept working. Because the work itself was the point, because there was something about rescuing a neglected thing that she could not resist and had never been able to explain. She was deep in the second raised bed when she heard the sound of boots on the hard ground behind her. "Miss Turner." She looked up. Nathan was standing at the edge of the garden. He was looking at the cleared beds with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that particular stillness that meant something had landed on him harder than he expected. "I was going to get to this," he said. "I know," she said. She went back to pulling weeds. "I got to it first." He didn't move for a moment. Then he crouched down on the far side of the bed and started pulling too. They worked without talking for a while. The silence between them was the easy kind, the kind that doesn't demand filling. She was aware of his presence the way you're aware of a fire in a room, not intrusively, just as a fact of warmth. "My mother planted this garden," he said after a while. Abigail kept her hands moving. "I figured," she said. "The beds are too well built to be accidental." She said a kitchen without a garden was just a room. He pulled a weed by the root and set it aside. She was right about most things. When did she die? 3 years ago, March. Fever. Fast. "I'm sorry." He glanced up. "You say that like you mean it." "I do mean it." He looked at her for a moment with that careful, considering expression she was getting used to. Then he looked back at the soil. "You lost someone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Everyone has," she said. "Not like that. Not the way you said it." She sat back on her heels. The sun was getting low. Her hands were dirty to the wrist. She looked at the far end of the garden and then back at the soil in front of her. "Both of them," she said. "A long time ago. Different fevers, same year. I was 22. The word parents hung between them, unspoken, understood. Nathan didn't offer condolences. He just nodded once and went back to pulling weeds. That was exactly the right thing to do, and she noticed it. They worked until the light gave out. The garden, when they stood back and looked at it, was still far from finished. But the bones of it were visible again. The shape of what it had been, and what it might be again, was there if you knew how to look. "Thank you," he said. "It needed doing," she said, and went inside to start dinner. She was at the stove when she heard voices from the front of the house. Nathan's low and measured, and another man's louder, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been turned away at a door. She recognized the tone, if not the words. She had heard that particular brand of confidence before. She kept stirring. 10 minutes later, Nathan came into the kitchen alone. He stood at the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee that he didn't drink. "Who was that?" she asked. "Harlan Voss," he said. "Owns the land south of mine. He's been trying to buy the broken spur for 2 years. Is he going to get it?" Nathan looked at the coffee cup. "Not while I'm breathing." "Then why do you look like that?" He glanced up. "Like something went wrong," she said. He set the cup down. "Because the banknote on this property is due in 8 weeks, he said. And the spring cattle were underpriced at market. And Voss knows both of those things because Voss makes it his business to know." He paused. "He came to offer me a number." "What number?" he told her. She turned back to the stove, but her mind was working. She had grown up around ranch finances. She knew what that number meant relative to what a working cattle operation should be worth. "He's offering half," she said. "Less than half. And he's offering it now because he thinks you're in a corner." "That's right." She stirred the pot. "Are you—" He was quiet for a long moment. "Getting close," he said. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. But the weight of it stayed in the kitchen long after he left, and she cooked with it, sitting beside her like an uninvited guest, thinking about corners and what it cost a person to fight their way out of one. The next morning, she found a way to stretch the food for one more day than she'd thought possible, and she said nothing about it. And Nathan noticed and said nothing either. And somehow, that silence between them was louder than most conversations she'd had in years. It was at the end of her second week that the first real crack appeared. Not between her and Nathan, between her and herself. She had found a sewing basket in the parlor, not by looking for it, but because she'd been cleaning the shelves near the fireplace, and a loose wicker edge had caught her sleeve. Inside the basket were needles, several cards of thread in carefully chosen colors, a pair of small scissors with painted handles, and a piece of unfinished needlework still on its frame. She should have put it back. She knew she should have put it back. She sat down on the parlor floor with the basket in her lap and looked at the unfinished work. A pattern of flowering vines half completed the thread still attached to the needle, as though the person doing it had simply stepped away for a moment and would be back directly. That was hers. Walter's voice came from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come downstairs. She looked up. The old man was standing in the hall, and his face was doing something complicated. Not anger, not grief exactly, something older than both. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I found it when I was—" "Her hands weren't right for it at the end," Walter said. He moved into the room slowly and lowered himself into the armchair near the window. Her fingers couldn't hold the needle. She never finished it. He looked at the frame in Abigail's hands. She was particular about colors. Said most women used colors that didn't belong together. Abigail looked down at the pattern. The colors were exquisite soft gold against deep blue. A thread of rust that shouldn't have worked, but did. "She was right," Abigail said. Walter looked at her. "You do needlework." "I used to," she said. "What happened?" She ran her thumb along the edge of the frame. "I stopped having things that felt worth finishing," she said. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then, without announcement, without preamble, he said, "That man in town. The one who sent for you." Abigail looked up. "I heard what he said to you," Walter said. His voice was flat and clear. "Word gets around in a place this size. I want you to know something." He paused, and she had the sense he was searching for words he didn't use very often. "A man who looks at a woman and can't see past the size of her is blind in a way that can't be fixed," he said. "And whatever that man told you about yourself, he was wrong. He didn't know what he was looking at." Abigail's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together and looked at the needlework. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm not saying it to be kind," Walter said. He sounded faintly irritated the way people do when they want to make clear they're not offering sentiment. "I'm saying it because it's true, and someone should have said it to your face before now." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Walter looked out the window. "You can finish it if you want," he said after a moment. "The needlework. She wouldn't mind. She never liked things left half done." Abigail held the frame carefully and didn't say anything, and somehow in the silence of that parlor, in the quiet company of a grieving old man, something she'd had knotted up behind her sternum for longer than she could remember loosened just a little. Not all the way, not even close, but a little. She was more careful after that. More careful about what she let show, and what she kept behind the wall she'd been building since she was 22 years old, and the world had taken everything from her, and then handed her a new name and a new life that fit like someone else's dress. She was more careful because Walter's words had cracked something open in her that she didn't entirely know how to close again, and she needed to close it because open things got hurt. It was the following Tuesday that Nathan found her crying. She hadn't known he was in the house. He'd said at breakfast that he'd be at the south pasture fence all day. She had assumed she had the afternoon to herself. She had been in her room with the door not quite closed because she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just sitting on the edge of the bed with the leather pouch in her hands, the old photograph held between her fingers, not looking at it so much as holding the history of it against her palms, when she heard his footstep in the hall. He stopped outside the door. She heard him stop. The silence was particular. She put the photograph away. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was already making herself presentable before she stood up. "I came back for the wire stretcher," Nathan said through the door. His voice was careful, even. "I forgot it." "It's in the lean-to," she said. Her voice came out steady. "On the left side, hanging on the third nail." A pause. "Thank you," he said. She heard him walk away. She heard the back door open and close. She stood in the center of her small room and looked at the wall and breathed. He was back from the south pasture by 6. He didn't say anything about the afternoon. He ate dinner without mentioning it. He told her the biscuits were better, which they were, because she'd found a way to make the lard stretch further and render cleaner. She told him she'd need the flour within the next 2 days, regardless of the Saturday schedule. "I'll go Thursday," he said. She looked at him. "It's fine," he said. "I need to talk to the banker anyway." She went back to the dishes. After a moment, she said quietly, and without looking at him, "Thank you for not asking." He was quiet for a second. "Everybody has things they carry in photographs," he said. "Doesn't always need talking about." She kept her eyes on the soapy water. "No," she said. "It doesn't." He left her to it. She stood at the sink for a long while after the water went cold. It was Walter who finally said it. 13 days after Abigail's arrival on a Friday evening, when the light outside had gone, the particular amber of late summer, and the kitchen smelled of the stew she'd made again, not from habit, but because the beans and the remaining beef needed using, and because it had worked. The first time, Walter lifted his spoon, paused with it halfway to his mouth, and set it back down in the bowl. Nathan looked up from his end of the table. Walter was staring at the stew with an expression neither of them had seen on him before. Not grief. Not memory exactly. Something sharper than that. Something that was working through him slowly like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. "Dad," Nathan said. Walter picked up his spoon again. Set it down again. He looked across the table at his son, and then he looked at Abigail with those pale, clear eyes. "Only one person," Walter said slowly, "ever made stew that tasted like this." The kitchen went very still. "Dad, I mean exactly like this." Walter touched the edge of the bowl. "The thyme first, and then the bay, and the beef browned longer than most people bother with, and the potatoes cut thick so they don't go to mush." He paused. "There's a ranch family east of here. Was a ranch family, the Carters. Had property about 100 miles out. Martha Carter made stew like this, taught her daughter before they—" He stopped. He looked at Abigail. "Before the family lost the ranch." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that had weight. Abigail did not move. She kept her face composed with the particular practiced stillness she had learned to maintain in moments that required her to feel nothing from the outside in. "A lot of women make stew," she said. "Not like this," Walter said. She met his eyes. His were steady, searching, not hostile, the eyes of a man who has spent 3 years withdrawn from the world and is now unexpectedly paying very close attention to something. "I learned the recipe from my mother," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "A lot of daughters do." Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his spoon and ate. But he didn't look away from her for the rest of the meal. And Nathan at the other end of the table had gone very still. She could feel it, his stillness, the way you feel weather coming before you see it. He wasn't looking at her directly. He was looking at his bowl. But his fork had stopped moving, and she knew without being told that his mind was doing what it did best, which was take a small specific detail and worry at it until it gave up its meaning. She cleared the table. She washed the dishes. She said goodnight to both of them and went to her room and sat on the bed and pressed both palms flat against the mattress over the leather pouch beneath it and closed her eyes. She stayed that way for a very long time. Later, much later, past 10 o'clock, she heard Nathan's footsteps cross the hall to the kitchen. She heard the particular sound she had heard before, the lid lifted from the pot briefly, then set back down. Then silence. But this time, there was something before the silence. This time, between the replacing of the lid and the quiet that followed, she heard him pull out a chair at the kitchen table. She heard him sit down. She heard the soft sound of paper unfolding. He had brought something to the table with him. She pressed her hands harder against the mattress and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Whatever Nathan Brooks had brought to that kitchen table in the middle of the night, it was not the wire stretcher. And whatever question was forming behind those steady, careful eyes of his Abigail Turner already knew the shape of the answer. She had always known this day would come. She had known it from the moment she had smelled the thyme and the bay in her own hands and felt the old recipe move through her like a second heartbeat. She had known it from the moment Walter had looked at her across the dinner table, with recognition flickering in his pale eyes, like a lamp trying to catch in the wind. She had run from this question before. She had changed her name, changed her county, changed everything about the surface of herself that could be changed, and for 7 years it had been enough. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of Nathan sitting at his kitchen table in the middle of the night, and she understood with absolute clarity that here in this house with this man, and his sharp, quiet mind, and his grieving father, and his mother's unfinished needlework, and his near-empty flour tin, here the question was not going to let her go. He found the name on a Thursday, not because he went looking for it, or at least that was what he told himself in those first few days after Walter's words at the dinner table had lodged themselves in his mind like a splinter he couldn't stop pressing. He told himself he was simply doing what any reasonable man would do when something didn't add up. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it had nothing to do with the way she had gone still at that table, the way her hands had stayed flat and quiet on either side of her bowl, while her face told him absolutely nothing. He rode into town on Thursday as he'd promised for the flour and the banker, and the list she'd pressed into his hand that morning without meeting his eyes. He did the flour first, then the dry goods, then the banker's office, where the conversation went exactly as badly as he'd expected, and left him standing on the boardwalk afterward with the particular hollow feeling of a man watching a door close on something he's not ready to lose. It was on his way back to the wagon that he passed the land registry office. He stopped. He stood on the boardwalk for a full minute, the flour sack in his arms, the sun bearing down on the back of his neck, and he had a conversation with himself about what kind of man goes digging into the history of a woman who has asked him precisely nothing except to be paid at the end of the week and left alone on Sunday afternoons. Then he went inside. The clerk was a thin, efficient man named Purvis, who had worked the land registry for as long as Nathan could remember, and who had the particular gift of retrieving information without appearing to notice what he was retrieving it for. Nathan asked about historical land records for ranching properties east of the county, the Carter family specifically. He said he was looking into some old grazing boundary questions. Purvis didn't blink. He came back with a file folder that was thicker than Nathan expected. Nathan stood at the counter and read. The Carter Ranch had been one of the largest private holdings in the Eastern Territory. 1,200 acres of good grazing land, water rights on 2 seasonal creeks, a herd of registered cattle, a house and outbuildings that had taken 20 years to build properly. Richard Carter had filed his homestead claim in 1851 and spent the next 3 decades making it into something real. He and his wife Martha had 1 daughter. The daughter's name was Emily. Nathan read the name twice. He read it a 3rd time. Then he kept reading. Richard Carter had died in the winter of 1871. His wife Martha followed 4 months later. Both deaths recorded as illness, consistent with what had been a bad fever season in the eastern counties that year. The daughter Emily, 22 years old at the time of her parents' deaths, had been the sole heir to the property. The property had been transferred out of Emily Carter's name 6 months after her mother's death. The transfer documentation listed the receiving parties as 2 men, a Thomas Hale and a Cornelius Marsh, identified as the deceased's brothers-in-law. The filing cited unpaid debts and a signed document in which Emily Carter relinquished her claim to the property and settlement. Nathan read that sentence 3 times. Then he looked up at Purvis and said, "Is there a record of the original debt documentation?" Purvis found it in the 2nd folder. The debt was dated 3 weeks after Martha Carter's death. The amount was implausible for a ranch that size. The signature at the bottom, Emily Carter's according to the filing, was witnessed by Thomas Hale himself. Nathan set the folder down on the counter and stood very still for a moment. Cornelius Marsh. He knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name. The Marsh family had property south of Dry Creek and connections to the county commissioner's office and a reputation for acquiring land at prices that had a way of seeming reasonable on paper and catastrophic in practice. Gerald Marsh, the man who had stood in the street 2 weeks ago and looked at Abigail Turner like she was a disappointment. He was returning to sender Gerald Marsh was Cornelius Marsh's son. Nathan drove home in a silence so complete he barely heard the road. He did not tell Abigail what he'd found. Not that night. Not the next morning. He sat with it the way he'd sat with the stew question, carefully turning it over, checking the edges. He was not a man who moved fast on things that mattered. He was a man who moved right. What he knew was, a woman named Emily Carter had lost everything she owned at 22 through documentation that had the particular smell of fraud on every page, and she had vanished from the public record entirely after that. And a woman named Abigail Turner had arrived in Dry Creek, carrying a battered suitcase and a stew recipe that had been in the Carter household for 2 generations, and a grief that she wore the way people wear old scars, so used to the weight of it, they've stopped noticing when it shows. He did not know what to do with any of it. What he did know was that whatever Abigail Turner had survived to get here, she had survived it without becoming someone who would let a man see her break. And whatever she was hiding it for reasons that had nothing to do with dishonesty, and everything to do with the particular mathematics of a woman who has learned that being known is the same as being vulnerable, and being vulnerable is the same as being destroyed. He respected that. He understood it in the bones of himself, in the place where his own losses lived. He was not going to force it open, but he was also not going to let it stay buried. The Saturday that followed was the one that changed everything. Harlan Voss came back. Not alone this time. He brought his lawyer, a man named Croft, who wore a city suit in a ranch town, and seemed proud of the fact, and he brought Gerald Marsh, which was a choice so deliberately pointed that Nathan felt it like a physical thing when he opened the front door and saw who was standing on his porch. Gerald Marsh did not look at Abigail, who appeared in the kitchen doorway when she heard the door, and then stood very still in the way she had when she needed to think fast. Abigail looked at Gerald Marsh with an expression that could have been cut from stone. "Brooks," Voss said, pleasant as a man holding all the cards can afford to be. "We'd like to talk numbers." "You talked numbers 2 weeks ago," Nathan said. "Different numbers now." Voss glanced at Croft. The lawyer produced a document and held it out. "The banknote situation's changed since we spoke. Croft here has had some conversations with your banker. Turns out the terms of the note allow for acceleration under certain conditions, meaning the full amount could come due in 30 days rather than 8 weeks. Nathan took the document. He looked at it without touching his expression. "Is that so? It's all there in the original filing. Hard to catch if you don't know what you're looking for." Voss smiled. "We're offering you a clean exit, Nathan. Fair market for what it's worth in its current condition. No mess, no default, no foreclosure on record." "What it's worth in its current condition," Nathan said, "is about 3 times what you're offering." "Well?" Voss spread his hands. "Markets are what they are." It was then that Gerald Marsh, who had been standing at the edge of the porch saying nothing, made his mistake. He looked at the kitchen doorway. He looked at Abigail. And he said casually, the way men say things they think won't matter, because they don't think anyone worth mattering to is listening. "Didn't realize you'd hired on extra help, Brooks. Interesting choice." The porch went quiet in a specific way. Nathan looked at Marsh. He took one slow breath, and he said with the particular quiet of a man who doesn't raise his voice, because he doesn't need to, "Miss Turner is the finest person currently standing on this property. I'd be careful about the next thing you say." Marsh's jaw tightened. He looked away. Croft cleared his throat. Nathan folded the document and held it out to Voss. "You'll have my answer by Wednesday," he said. "Good day, gentlemen." He waited until they were off the porch and moving toward the gate before he closed the door. He stood in the entry hall with the folded document in his hand and the sound of hooves moving away outside. And then he heard Abigail's footsteps cross the kitchen, and he heard the stove lid settle, and he heard the particular sound of someone keeping themselves busy so they don't have to stand still with what they're feeling. He went to the kitchen doorway. She was at the stove. Her back was to him. Her spine was straight in the way that meant she was holding herself together by choice. "That document's not as airtight as they want me to think," he said. "No," she said. "It probably isn't." "How do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. That kind of paper always has a seam, she said, if you pull at it in the right place. He looked at her back, at the set of her shoulders, at the careful way her hands were moving over the stove like she was paying attention to anything but the conversation. "Abigail," he said. She turned. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes and her chin level, and her expression saying clearly that she knew exactly where this was going and had already decided whether or not she could survive it. "Who is Emily Carter?" he said. The kitchen was very quiet. She set down the spoon. She turned to face him fully. She didn't look away, and she didn't answer, and the silence stretched between them for long enough that he heard the clock in the hallway mark the half hour. "Where did you find that name?" she said. "Land registry." "The transfer records." "Yes." She closed her eyes. Just briefly, just a single breath with her eyes closed. The way people close their eyes when they're acknowledging something they already knew was coming. Then she opened them. "I need to sit down," she said. They sat at the kitchen table. The stove ticked behind them. The afternoon light came through the window that she had cleaned on her third day, and the garden outside was visible. The garden they had pulled weeds from together side by side, in a silence that had felt like the beginning of something neither of them had named. She told him, not all of it at once, not in a clean linear story, the way a person tells something they've rehearsed. She told it the way people tell the truest things in pieces, with stops and starts, with silences that lasted a little too long before the next part came. Her name was Emily Carter. She was born on the ranch her father had spent 20 years building, and she had grown up in its fields and its kitchen, and understood before she was old enough to put words to it that the land was not just property. It was the physical proof that her family had done something real in the world. Her parents had died within 4 months of each other, and she had been 22 and grieving, and so deep in loss that she had not been paying attention to the right things. She had trusted her uncle's husband, Thomas Hale, because he had been at family dinners and Christmas tables, and had called her by her first name, and seemed to mean it. Hale had arrived 3 weeks after her mother's death with documents. He had explained them patiently. He had told her they were a formality, that they protected her interests, that her father had outstanding debts that needed addressing before the estate could be properly settled, that signing would ensure she kept the ranch free and clear. She had signed. She had found out what she'd signed 6 weeks later, when a man from the county court arrived to inform her that the property had been legally transferred, and she had 30 days to vacate. "They forged the debt," she said. Her voice was level. It had the particular flatness of something that has been described so many times internally that the words have lost their original weight. Not all of it. Some of it was real small debts, the kind any working ranch carries. But they inflated everything, and they added items that never existed, and they backdated documents, and they made sure the whole thing was witnessed and filed before I understood what had happened. Nathan's hands were flat on the table. He didn't move them. "I tried to fight it," she said. "I went to 3 lawyers. 2 of them told me the documentation was ironclad. The third one took my money, and then stopped returning my letters." She paused. "I didn't have money for a 4th. "What happened after?" "I left," she said. "I changed my name. I worked wherever I could find work, cooking, cleaning, keeping house. I was good at it." Her mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Turned out, those were the skills that mattered. "Why the name change?" She looked at the table. "Because Emily Carter was a woman who'd lost everything, and everyone knew it," she said. "And wherever I went, if people knew who I was, one of 2 things happened. Either they pitied me in ways that made it impossible to hold my head up, or they saw the name, and they saw the land records, and they decided there might still be something worth taking." She looked up. "I was done being taken from." "Marsh," Nathan said. "Gerald Marsh." She met his eyes. "His father," Nathan said. "Cornelius Marsh. He's one of the 2 names on the transfer documentation." The color drained from her face so slowly and completely that Nathan reached forward before he'd decided to, and put his hand over hers on the table. She looked down at his hand. She didn't pull away. She sat very still. "His father was the other one," she said. It wasn't a question. She was saying it out loud, to make it real, to give herself the chance to hear it in the air outside her own skull. "Yes," Nathan said. "Gerald Marsh put an advertisement in the Eastern papers for a mail-order bride," she said slowly. "Yes. And I answered it, because I was 2 counties over and using a different name, and I had no reason to know." "No," Nathan said. "You had no reason." She closed her eyes. Her hand under his was completely still. "He saw me step off the stagecoach," she said, "and he decided I wasn't worth the inconvenience." Her voice was careful and even, and underneath it was something that would take years to fully name. "He didn't know who I was. He just didn't like what I looked like." "He's an idiot," Nathan said. She laughed. It surprised them both, a short, involuntary sound that was not quite funny and not quite sad. She pressed her fingers against her mouth. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "I meant it." She opened her eyes. She looked at their hands on the table, his over hers, both of them still. She didn't move away, and neither did he. "Does it change things?" she asked. "What you know now?" "Which things?" "The work, the arrangement." She looked up at him. "Me being here." Nathan looked at her steadily. "The only thing it changes," he said, "is that I'm going to need to make some inquiries about those land records." She stared at him. "Nathan, I know a man," he said. "An attorney, not the kind that stops returning letters. He's based out of Cheyenne, and he's honest in the way that only about 1 in 50 lawyers manage to be." He paused. "The documentation they used would have seams. Forgeries always do. They didn't think you'd ever have money or standing enough to pull at them." "I don't," she said. "I have $11, or I did before you paid me last Friday. I have slightly more than that," he said. "And I have a land dispute of my own that needs an attorney's eyes anyway." He looked at her. "It's practical." "It's not practical," she said. "You're doing it because it's right," he said. And the simplicity of it, the complete uncomplicated certainty in his voice, landed on her like something physical. Like a hand on the shoulder, when you've been carrying something heavy for long enough that you've forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. Once. Because she didn't have words for it, and she suspected he didn't need them. It was Walter who heard them. Neither of them had noticed the old man in the hallway. He had come downstairs for water, the kind of quiet errand that old men make in the afternoon, and he had stopped in the hall when he heard voices at the table, and he had stood there long enough to hear the shape of the story, if not all the words. When Nathan looked up, Walter was standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Abigail for a long time. She looked back at him and did not look away because she had decided somewhere in the middle of telling Nathan the truth that she was done looking away from things. "Emily Carter," Walter said. It was barely a sound, more like a breath that had a name in it. "Yes," Abigail said. Walter came into the kitchen. He sat down in his chair, the one closer to the window, the one that had been repositioned to give him room to breathe. He set his hands on the table and looked at them. His face was doing that complicated thing again, the thing that was older than grief and sharper than memory. "I knew your father," he said. The kitchen seemed to tilt. "Richard Carter." Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper. "Worked the same circuit Eastern grazing territory back in the late 50s, Walter said. "Good man, honest man, the kind of man who paid his debts before they were due and remembered the names of other men's children." He paused. "He talked about you, his daughter. Said you could read a weather pattern better than most ranch hands twice your age." Abigail's eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together. "He would be," Walter said and stopped. He seemed to be choosing the words with great care. "He would be angry," he said finally, "at what happened, at what they did." He looked up at her. "And he would not for one moment want you to be ashamed of a single thing." Abigail Turner, who had been Emily Carter for 22 years, and Abigail Turner for 7, who had cooked and cleaned and kept herself small and hidden in kitchens across 3 counties, who had changed her name and her history and the surface of herself to make a target smaller. Abigail put her face in her hands and let herself cry in front of two people for the first time since she was 22 years old. She did not cry for long. She was not a woman who cried for long, but she cried fully, which was different, which was the kind of crying that takes something with it when it leaves. Nathan did not speak. He kept his hand over hers. Walter looked out the window. Nobody moved to make it shorter or more comfortable, and somehow that was the most respectful thing they could have done. When she lifted her face, she looked at both of them in turn. Her eyes were red. Her chin was steady. "Nobody can know," she said. "Not yet. Not until if there's going to be any legal process, if there's any possibility of—" She stopped. "If Voss and Marsh find out who I am before we have anything solid, they'll move fast. They have connections. They'll bury it." "Nobody's going to know," Nathan said. "I need your word on that." "You have it." She looked at Walter. The old man held her gaze. "I have kept secrets longer than you've been alive," he said. "I expect I can manage a while longer." She nodded. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She picked up the spoon she'd set down and went back to the stove and checked the heat and adjusted it because it was what needed doing, and because doing what needed doing was the thing she knew best in the world. "The attorney," she set her back to both of them. "When could he come?" "I'll write to him tonight," Nathan said. "And Voss's deadline, Wednesday. That's 4 days." "I know when Wednesday is," he said, and there was something in his voice that she recognized, an echo of her own words from 2 weeks ago, said back to her with a warmth underneath it that hadn't been there the first time. She almost smiled. She didn't let herself, but it was close. She stirred the pot. The stew was ready. "Dinner in 10 minutes, she said, and outside in the garden, she had pulled back from wilderness with her own hands. The first small shoots of the replanted vegetable beds were pushing through the dark soil, green and persistent and unreasonably alive against all the odds that had been stacked against them. Nathan went to his study and picked up a pen and began writing the most important letter he'd sent in years. And in the kitchen, over a pot of stew that carried a history nobody had intended to resurrect, Abigail Turner stood straight and breathed and allowed herself for the first time in 7 years to feel something that was not quite hope, but was close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. Not yet, but getting there. Nathan's letter reached Cheyenne in 5 days. The reply came back in 4. He read it at the kitchen table before breakfast, while Abigail was at the stove, and Walter was still upstairs, and when he set the letter down, his face had the particular stillness of a man who has just received exactly what he needed, and is now reckoning with what it's going to cost. "He's coming," Nathan said. Abigail didn't turn from the stove. "When?" "End of next week. He says he'll need to see the original transfer documentation from the Carter property, whatever copies exist in the county record. And he wants to talk to anyone who had direct knowledge of the Carter family before the transfer." She stirred the pot. Her hand was steady. "That's Walter." "Yes." "Does he know what he's agreeing to?" "I told him in the letter what we were dealing with, generally." Nathan folded the letter and set it on the table. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that there is no faster way to make him interested in a case than to put the name Cornelius Marsh on the front page of it. Abigail turned. "He knows the name. Marsh has been doing this for 30 years, Nathan said. My attorney's been trying to build a case against him for nearly as long. The problem is always the same. The people he defrauded don't have resources, and the ones who do have resources aren't interested in justice. They're interested in staying comfortable." He looked at her. "You're different." "I have no resources," she said. "You have something better," he said. "You're still alive, and you remember everything." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the stove. Wednesday came first, and with it came Voss. He arrived alone this time, which was either a concession or a trap, and Nathan met him on the porch with his arms crossed, and the particular expression he'd been developing since he was 16 years old, the one that said he'd heard everything you were about to say and had already decided how to answer it. "I'm not selling," Nathan said before Voss could speak. Voss stopped on the second porch step. He looked up at Nathan with the patient expression of a man who has learned to treat refusals as opening positions. The banknote. I've spoken to the bank, Nathan said. The acceleration clause you referenced requires a 60-day notice period that your attorney neglected to mention. I've got 53 days remaining on the original terms. Voss's jaw shifted slightly. That clause is subject to interpretation. Then we can let a judge interpret it. Nathan held the door frame with one hand. I've retained an attorney. He arrives next week. If Croft wants to have a conversation about interpretations, he's welcome to have it with someone who passed the bar. The silence on that porch was the kind that meant someone had miscalculated. Voss looked at him for a long moment. This is a harder fight than you can afford, Brooks. Maybe, Nathan said. But it's mine to have. Voss left without another word. Nathan watched him go and then went inside and stood in the kitchen for a full minute with his hands on the counter and his head down breathing before he straightened up. Abigail was sitting at the table. She had heard every word through the kitchen window. 53 days, she said, give or take. Is that enough time? He looked at her. It has to be, he said. The attorney's name was Charles Aldred, and he arrived on a Tuesday afternoon that was cool enough to remind everyone that summer was beginning its slow retreat. He was a compact man in his late 50s with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that moved over everything in a room the way experienced lawyers' eyes do, cataloging, assessing, missing nothing. He shook Nathan's hand on the porch, nodded at Walter, who had come outside for the occasion, and then looked at Abigail with an expression she recognized as professional courtesy rather than anything personal. Miss Turner, he said. Mr. Aldred, she said. I understand you have a different name you were born with. Emily Carter, she said. She had been practicing saying it out loud for 9 days now, ever since the kitchen table conversation, and it still felt like putting weight on a leg that had been broken and healed crooked. But it held. Aldred nodded slowly. I knew of your father's ranch, he said. By reputation. Richard Carter had a name for fair dealing in the Eastern Territory. He paused. I'm sorry for what happened to his family. So am I, she said. What can you do about it? He almost smiled. That's precisely what we're going to determine. Shall we sit down? They sat at the kitchen table, all four of them, which felt crowded and also exactly right. Aldred produced his own documents and spread them carefully on the surface. He asked questions in a specific order that felt less like conversation and more like architecture, each question building on the last shaping, something from the ground up. He asked about the timeline of her parents' deaths. He asked about Thomas Hale's first appearance after the funeral. He asked about the documents she'd signed, what she'd been told, how many witnesses had been present, what names she remembered. He asked about the lawyers she'd consulted afterward. He wrote everything down in a small, precise hand. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was a gesture she would come to recognize as his thinking posture, the brief upward pause before he spoke. The weakness in their case, he said, assuming they were operating the way I believe they were, is the debt documentation. The genuine debts they inflated would have paper trails. Real creditors, men who were actually owed money, who will have their own records of what they were actually owed. He looked at her. If we can find even 2 or 3 of those original creditors and demonstrate the gap between what they were owed and what appears in the Hale filing, we establish a pattern. Pattern becomes evidence. 7 years is a long time, Abigail said. Creditors move, records get lost. Some, Aldred agreed. Not all. Ranching debts of that size tend to involve men who kept careful books. He paused. Also, the witness signatures on your parents' death records. I want to look at those. Why? Because if Thomas Hale had connections to the county recording office, which based on his subsequent dealings I believe he did, it's possible the cause of death documentation is not entirely accurate. The kitchen went quiet. You think they were... Nathan stopped. I think nothing yet, Aldred said carefully. I think the timeline is unusual. Two people in robust health for their age dying within 4 months of each other, both of illness in a year where the fever deaths in that county were not statistically elevated. He looked at Abigail steadily. I'm not making an accusation. I'm identifying a question. Abigail's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at Aldred with an expression that was very controlled and very, very careful. Ask the question, she said. I'm at the end of the table, saying nothing throughout this entire conversation, speaking less than any of them, but listening harder than all of them combined. Set his coffee cup down with a deliberate click. I have a name for you, Walter said. Everyone looked at him. A man named Gideon Park, Walter said. He worked the Eastern Territory as a traveling physician in the early 70s. Honest man, kept meticulous records of every patient he saw. I knew him professionally. He paused. I believe he attended the Carter household during the illness. Aldred looked at him. Do you know where he is now? Retired, Walter said. He has a house in Laramie. We corresponded until about 2 years ago when my letter writing fell off. He glanced away. I can write to him today if you believe it's worth doing. Aldred was already writing. I believe it's very worth doing. Nathan watched his father speak more consecutive sentences than he had managed in 3 years, and something in his chest moved in a way he hadn't expected and didn't entirely have words for. The investigation moved the way investigations do when the right person is conducting them, not fast in the way of explosions, but steady in the way of water, finding every crack in rock persistent and inevitable, and utterly unmoved by obstacles. Aldred rode to the county registry and spent a full day with the land records. He sent letters to 2 surviving creditors he'd located through the original debt filing. He wrote to the county medical recorder. He wrote to Gideon Park in Laramie. In the meantime, word had moved around Dry Creek the way word always moves in small towns, not announced, but felt like a change in pressure before a storm. People noticed that Nathan Brooks had an attorney staying at the Broken Spur. People noticed that Harlan Voss had stopped coming by. People noticed, in the way that small towns always notice the things they're not supposed to, that something was happening. Abigail went on cooking. She went on cleaning. She went back to work on the vegetable garden every afternoon and was rewarded with the first real harvest of the season beans and summer squash, and the beginnings of what would be a serious stand of tomatoes if the weather held. She brought a basket of beans to the elderly widow who lived at the edge of the North Road and who had looked at her with something approaching kindness on her first day in town when everyone else had been looking elsewhere. The widow's name was May Hollis, and she was 81 years old and entirely clear in her mind. She took the beans with both hands and looked at Abigail with sharp, assessing eyes and said, "You're the woman Gerald Marsh made a fool of in the street." "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said. "Sit down," May Hollis said. Abigail sat. May Hollis knew things. This was not entirely a surprise. Women who are 81 and still entirely clear in their minds generally do know things, but the specific things she knew surprised even Abigail. She knew about the Marsh family's land dealings going back 15 years. She knew about 3 other ranching families who had sold under circumstances that still didn't feel right to the people who'd been watching. She knew with the confidence of a woman who has had 8 decades to develop her instincts that Harlan Voss and Cornelius Marsh had been operating as a team for longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. "Nobody talks about it," May said with the blunt practicality of the very old, because the people who got hurt are gone, and the people who are still here don't want to be next. "Would you talk about it?" Abigail asked. "To an attorney." May looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "Depends on the attorney." "His name is Charles Aldred. He's from Cheyenne." "I know that name," May said. "He handled the Whitfield dispute in '79. She set her cup down. "Bring him by Thursday afternoon. I'll have pie." Aldred came back from Thursday's meeting with May Hollis with 4 pages of notes and an expression that Abigail was beginning to recognize as the lawyer equivalent of a man who has just found exactly what he was looking for in exactly the right place. "She's a remarkable witness," he said at the kitchen table that evening. She's 81, Nathan said. Juries love sharp old women, Aldred said without looking up from his notes. They remind them of their grandmothers, and they're constitutionally incapable of doubting them. He turned a page. She has direct recollection of a conversation she overheard between Cornelius Marsh and Thomas Hale at the Dry Creek General Store in the spring of 1872, approximately 4 months before the Carter transfer was filed. Abigail looked up from her hands. She overheard Hale say that the daughter was going to be difficult, Aldred said, and Marsh replied that they didn't need her cooperation, only her signature. The room was very still. She remembered that specific sentence, Abigail said. She said she remembered it because it made her feel cold, Aldred said. And she went home and wrote it in her diary. She still has the diary. Nathan looked at Abigail. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, and her face doing something private and enormous that she was working very hard not to show. They planned it, she said. Her voice was barely above steady. Before my mother even died. They were planning it while she was still alive. That's what the evidence suggests, Aldred said carefully. She nodded. Once. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the table. Nathan watched her pull herself back from the edge of something and settle very deliberately into a stillness that was not calm, but was close enough to it that she could function. What else do we need? She said. One more thing, Aldred said. He looked at her directly. I need you to stand in front of this town and say your name. She looked at him. Not in a courtroom, not yet. But the story of what happened to Emily Carter needs to be told where the people who knew your father can hear it. Where the people who've been afraid of Voss and Marsh can see that someone is standing up. He paused. May Hollis is willing to stand beside you. There are 2 others I've spoken with in the last week who are also willing, but it starts with you. The silence lasted long enough for the clock in the hall to tick through a full minute. Where? She said. May suggested the church, Sunday after service. Another silence. That's 5 days, she said. Yes. She looked at Nathan. He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes that never pushed and never pulled and never asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was ready to be. All right, she said. The 5 days between that kitchen table conversation and the Sunday that would change everything were the strangest of Abigail's life. Stranger than the week after her parents died. Stranger than the morning she'd signed papers she didn't understand. Stranger even than the afternoon she'd stepped off a stagecoach in a town where she didn't know a soul, and had her dignity removed in public by a man who'd never deserved a minute of her time. Because this time she wasn't waiting for something bad. She was waiting for something she'd chosen. And the particular weight of a chosen thing is entirely different from the weight of something that happens to you, heavier in some ways, lighter in others, and more frightening than either, because when you choose something, you own what comes of it. She cooked. She tended the garden. She sat with Walter in the evenings and worked on his wife's unfinished needlework with him watching from his chair, never asking what she was making of it, just present. She walked into Dry Creek on Friday to buy thread from the general store, and held her head at the same level she always held it, and looked at the people who looked at her and didn't look away. Gerald Marsh saw her from across the street on Friday afternoon. She saw him see her. She stopped walking. She looked at him directly across the full width of the dusty street with the complete unhurried attention of a woman who has decided she is done making herself invisible. He looked away first. She kept walking. Nathan found her in the garden that evening, working later than usual, her hands moving through the soil with the focused energy of someone who needs physical effort to process something interior. You all right? He asked. I saw Marsh today, she said. In town. He crouched down to her level, which he always did, which she had noticed from the first day and had never forgotten. What happened? Nothing, she said. I looked at him until he looked away. She pulled a weed and set it aside. It felt different than I expected. Different how? She was quiet for a moment. Less satisfying, she said. And also more. She looked up at him. Does that make sense? It means you're past him, Nathan said. Past that part of it. She held his gaze. What part comes next? He looked at her, really looked at her the way he had from the first day, but with something in it now that was neither questioning nor reserved. Something that had found its answer and was simply resting there in the open, not requiring anything. Whatever you want it to, he said. She held that for a moment. Then she went back to the garden. But she didn't pull any more weeds. She just smoothed the soil with the flat of her hand back and forth, feeling the warmth the sun had left in it. I want to get through Sunday first, she said. Then we start there, he said. Saturday night, Abigail couldn't sleep. She lay in her room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch house breathe around her, the particular creaks and settlings of an old building that she had come to know as well in 4 weeks, as most people know a place in years. She knew which floorboard spoke when Walter came downstairs for water. She knew the sound the kitchen stove made when the temperature dropped past a certain point. She knew the particular silence of Nathan's study at midnight, when he'd finally put down his pen. She took the leather pouch from under the mattress. She sat up in the dark and opened it and took out the photograph. She hadn't looked at it since the night Nathan had come back for the wire stretcher and stopped outside her door. She looked at it now. Her parents stood in front of the ranch house that had been hers once. Her father tall and broad-shouldered, her mother slight beside him, both of them squinting into the sun with the particular expression of people who are being photographed for the first time and aren't sure what to do with their faces. Behind them, the structure of the house, the fence line, the beginning of the garden. She had her father's eyes. She had known that. She hadn't let herself look at it in years. I'm going to say my name tomorrow, she said to the photograph, in front of people. She paused. I'm scared. She paused again. I thought you should know. She sat with them for a while. Her father with his big hands and his straight back, and his reputation for fair dealing that had survived him by 7 years. Her mother who had taught her how to make stew in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and thyme and things that mattered. She put the photograph back in the pouch and put the pouch back under the mattress. She lay down and closed her eyes, and this time, after a while, sleep came. Sunday morning arrived with a clarity of light that had nothing to do with forgiveness, and everything to do with October beginning its advance from the north, cool, direct, precise. Abigail dressed in the better of her 2 dresses. She had altered it in the last 2 weeks, taking in seams and adding a small detail at the collar that she'd fashioned from the thread she'd bought on Friday, and it fit her now in the way that clothes fit people who are comfortable enough in their own bodies to let fabric do what it's supposed to do. She looked in the small mirror in her room. She looked at herself for a full 30 seconds, which was longer than she'd allowed herself to look in 7 years. Then she picked up her shawl and went downstairs. Nathan was at the kitchen table in his good jacket. Walter was standing at the door, already in his hat and coat. Which had not happened, Nathan told her later with quiet amazement in his voice, in just over 2 years. The 3 of them walked to the church together. May Hollis was already there in the front pew with the ramrod posture of a woman who has never in her life been intimidated by a room. She nodded at Abigail when they came in, and the nod said everything that needed saying. The service passed over Abigail's head in a river of sound she barely heard. She was aware of faces, familiar ones, from her weeks of going into town, less familiar ones from farther out. A few she didn't recognize at all. She was aware of Aldred seated near the back, quiet and watchful. She was aware with the particular animal alertness of someone who has learned to track threats in a room that Gerald Marsh and his father Cornelius were 3 rows back on the left side. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes forward and her hands still in her lap and breathed at a rate she controlled deliberately. When the service ended, the pastor stepped back and Charles Aldred stepped forward. He addressed the room briefly in the precise and unfussy way of a man who knows that every unnecessary word is a risk. He said that there was a matter of historical record that needed to be established publicly concerning the Carter Ranch and its transfer in 1872. He said he represented a party whose interests had been significantly harmed by documentation that evidence now suggested was fraudulent. He said that the relevant party was present and wished to speak. He sat down. The room was so quiet that Abigail could hear her own heartbeat. She stood up. She turned to face the room. Every face in the church was looking at her. She felt the weight of it, all those eyes, all that attention, all that history concentrated into one still moment. And then she said clearly, and without faltering, "My name is Emily Carter. My father was Richard Carter. He built the Carter Ranch in the Eastern Territory starting in 1851, and it was stolen from me in 1872 through forged documentation and deliberate fraud." In the third row on the left side, Cornelius Marsh stood up. "That is an outrageous—" "Sit down, Mr. Marsh." Aldred's voice cut across the room like a clean blade. "You will have the opportunity to respond to these accusations in the appropriate legal venue. This is not that venue." Marsh's face was the color of old brick. He stayed standing. "Sir?" It was Walter Brooks's voice from the second row, old and dry and carrying the absolute certainty of a man who has nothing left to fear. "Sit down." Cornelius Marsh sat down. Nathan stood up. He stood up without saying a word, and he turned so the room could see him clearly, and he stood beside Abigail, with his arms at his sides, and his face forward, and his presence saying, in the wordless language that matters most in small communities, everything that needed saying. May Hollis stood up next. Then an older rancher named Pete Duggan, who'd been sitting in the fifth row, and who Nathan knew had sold his property to Voss, under circumstances that had never sat right with him. Then the widow from the edge of the North Road, one by one. Not many, but enough. Abigail stood at the front of that church and looked at the faces of people choosing to stand beside her, and she held herself very still, because if she didn't hold still, the sheer force of it was going to knock her sideways. Gerald Marsh, 3 rows back, was staring at the floor. "My father was an honest man," Abigail said to the room, to the record, to the photograph under her mattress, and the recipe in her hands, and the 7 years of hiding that were ending right here in this room, in this light, with these people standing around her. "He built something real. And what was done to our family was wrong." She paused. "I am not asking for sympathy. I am stating a fact. And I intend to let the law establish the rest." She sat down. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her knees and held them still. Nathan sat beside her. His arm was against hers, shoulder to elbow, solid and deliberate and warm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside the church, when the congregation filed out into the October morning, Abigail stood on the steps and breathed the cool air and felt the particular sensation of something that has been held underground for a very long time, finally breaking the surface. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. There were legal proceedings ahead, and documents to produce, and a fight that would take months and cost more than she currently had, and test every piece of endurance she'd built in 7 years of rebuilding herself from the ground up. But she was standing in the light, with her real name in her mouth, and people beside her, and the broken spur behind her, and a man who had looked at her from the first day without pity, and without judgment, and without flinching. And she was not hiding. For the first time in 7 years, Emily Carter was not hiding. The morning after the church, nobody in Dry Creek talked about anything else. Abigail knew this the way she knew most things about small towns. Not because anyone told her directly, but because of the particular quality of the silence when she walked into the general store on Monday to collect the week's supplies. The silence that had a shape to it. The silence of people who have been discussing something and have agreed without words to stop discussing it in front of the person it concerns. She set her list on the counter and waited while the clerk filled it, and she felt the eyes on her back and kept her spine straight and her chin level, and bought her flour and her lard and her dried fruit, and walked back to the wagon with everything she'd come for. Nathan was waiting by the horses. "Voss's attorney filed something this morning," he said before she could speak. "What kind of something?" "A counterclaim, arguing the transfer documentation was entirely valid and that any challenge constitutes harassment of legal property owners." He took the basket from her hands without asking and set it in the wagon bed. Aldred expected it. Does Aldred know? He was at the courthouse when they filed it. Nathan checked the harness with his hands, moving efficiently over the leather, the way they moved when he was thinking about something other than what his hands were doing. He sent a message to the ranch this morning. He said, and again I'm quoting, that this is the best possible news because it means they're scared. Abigail climbed up to the wagon seat. Scared people make mistakes. That's what he said. Nathan came around and climbed up beside her. He also said we need the physician, Park, from Laramie. Walter's letter to Gideon Park had gone out the same day Aldred had asked for it. The reply had arrived 4 days later, a single page in a small, precise hand that Walter had read aloud at the dinner table in a voice that didn't waver, which cost him something and which none of them commented on. Gideon Park remembered the Carter household. He remembered both visits, the first when Richard Carter's fever broke in a direction that concerned him, the second when Martha Carter declined faster than he had expected, given her initial presentation. He had written notes. He had kept those notes for 50 years because he was the kind of physician who believed that records existed to tell the truth even when no one was asking. He would come to Dry Creek. He needed 2 weeks to arrange his affairs. 2 weeks, Aldred said, was workable. Cornelius Marsh apparently did not agree because 6 days after the church, 6 days of legal filings and counterfilings and the particular tension of a town watching two forces line up against each other, Cornelius Marsh made a mistake. He sent Gerald to the Broken Spur. Gerald arrived on a Thursday evening alone, which told Nathan immediately that this was not an official visit. Official visits brought lawyers. This was something else. Gerald had the look of a man who has been sent to do something he doesn't entirely want to do, and is covering the reluctance with a performance of confidence. Nathan met him on the porch. "I'd like to speak to the woman," Gerald said. He had stopped using her name, either name, which Nathan took as a sign that the reality of who she was had finally penetrated in a way that made him uncomfortable. "She's in the kitchen," Nathan said. "And she's not required to speak to you." "It's not. I'm not here on my father's behalf." Gerald's jaw worked. Officially. But unofficially. "There are things that could be simplified," Gerald said, "if she were willing to discuss a settlement." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. "Wait here," he said. He went inside. He found Abigail at the stove, which is where she always was, when she was thinking hard, using the work of cooking as ballast against whatever her mind was doing. "Gerald Marsh is on the porch," he said. "He wants to discuss a settlement. I told him you don't have to talk to him. I mean that you don't." She stood still for a moment with the spoon in her hand. Then she set it down carefully, wiped her hands on her apron, and took the apron off and hung it on its hook with deliberate, unhurried movements. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Abigail." "I want to," she said. She looked at Nathan with clear, calm eyes. "I've been running from things that scared me for 7 years. I'd like to stop." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back and let her through. She came out onto this porch and stood in the evening light and looked at Gerald Marsh. And he looked at her, and the first thing she noticed was that he looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was still taller than her by 6 inches, and broader by any measure. But the particular confidence that had allowed him to stand in the middle of a street and reduce her to a punchline had gone somewhere, and what was left was a man in his 30s who was beginning to understand the dimensions of what his family had done. "Miss..." He stopped, started again. "Emily." "You can call me Abigail," she said. "I'm used to it." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just to give her hands something to do. "What kind of settlement?" Gerald glanced at Nathan, who was leaning in the doorframe with his arms crossed, and his expression saying clearly that he was staying exactly where he was. "My father is willing to offer a cash payment," Gerald said. "Significant. Enough to set you up properly somewhere, a fresh start. In exchange for withdrawing the legal challenge." "Yes." "And signing something that confirms the original transfer was valid." Gerald's mouth tightened. "There would be some documentation, yes." Abigail looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he shifted his weight, which was something she noticed. "Mr. Marsh," she said. Let me tell you something your father apparently didn't bother to explain to you." She kept her voice even and clear. "That ranch was my father's life. He broke his back and spent 20 years building it into something real. My mother grew a kitchen garden and raised a daughter and made a home out of raw territory. When they died, that land was all I had left of them. Not the money, the land. The specific dirt, the specific fence lines, the specific place where my mother planted her beans every spring." She paused. "Your father took that. Not in a fair fight and not through honest dealing. He took it through fraud and forged documents and a girl who was 22 years old and too deep in grief to see what was happening." Gerald said nothing. "So, when you talk to me about a settlement," she said, "you're asking me to decide how much my parents' lives were worth in cash. And the answer to that question is that there is no number, Mr. Marsh. There is no number your father can write on a piece of paper that changes what was done." She paused. "What I want is the record corrected. I want the truth in the official documents. I want what was stolen acknowledged as stolen. That's what I want. And no settlement buys that." Gerald stood on the porch step and looked at her, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, she saw something in his face that might have been something close to shame. Not enough. Not nearly enough for what his family had done. But something. "He's not going to go quietly," Gerald said. His voice was lower now. "My father. He has connections you can't account for. Judges, county officials, men who owe him." "I know," she said. "You could lose everything. Again." "I've already lost everything," she said. "I lost it 7 years ago, and I survived it. If I lose this fight, I'll survive that too." She looked at him steadily. "But I don't think I'm going to lose." Gerald Marsh looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked off the porch and got on his horse and rode back toward town, and Abigail watched him go, and then turned and went inside without looking at Nathan, because she needed 30 seconds in the kitchen alone before she trusted her legs entirely. She was gripping the counter with both hands when Nathan came in. "You all right?" he asked. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her a minute. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. The trial, when it came, was not in Dry Creek. Aldred had anticipated that a local venue would be compromised. Too many connections, too many obligations, too many people who had learned to look the other way when the Marsh name was involved. He filed for a change of venue, citing documented conflicts of interest, and the request was granted after a 3-week delay that felt like waiting for weather. The hearing was moved to Cheyenne. They rode north on a cold October morning, the 4 of them, Nathan and Abigail, in the wagon, Walter surprisingly insistent on coming wrapped in 2 coats and a blanket, and more alert than he'd been in years. Aldred rode separately, his briefcase across his saddle. Gideon Park, who had arrived in Dry Creek the previous week, rode in a hired conveyance behind them, a spare, quiet man who treated his memory of the Carter household with the same careful precision he'd applied to every patient he'd seen in 50 years of practice. May Hollis traveled by train. She arrived in Cheyenne 2 hours ahead of all of them and was already seated in the waiting room outside the hearing chamber when they got there, hat-straight posture, perfect diary in her lap. Abigail sat down beside her. "You look terrified," May said pleasantly. "I'm not terrified," Abigail said. "You look terrified," May repeated. "That's fine. Terrified is honest. It'll read better than calm in there." She patted Abigail's hand once briefly. "Your father would be proud of you." Abigail looked at the old woman. "Did you know him?" "I knew of him," May said. "In the way you know of people who do things right in a world where most people do things conveniently." She straightened her hat. "That's a kind of knowing that matters." Cornelius Marsh arrived with 2 attorneys, both well-dressed, both carrying the specific confidence of men who have won by superior resources before and expect to win that way again. He was a large man in his 60s, gray-haired, with the permanently settled expression of someone who has not been seriously questioned in decades. He did not look at Abigail when he entered. Thomas Hale was not present. Aldred had noted this, and said only that it was interesting. The hearing lasted 2 days. Aldred was methodical in the way of a man who has been building to this specific moment for a long time. He entered the original Carter land records. He entered the debt documentation with the inflated figures highlighted in precise notation. He brought forward the testimony of 2 original creditors, elderly men, one of them transported from 3 counties over, who confirmed clearly and without hesitation what and when they had been paid. The gap between the real numbers and the numbers in Hale's documentation was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation. Then Gideon Park took the stand. He was 78 years old, and he spoke in the measured, careful way of a man who has spent his entire life understanding that words in a medical context carry weight. He described his visits to the Carter household. He described his clinical observations. He described the specific nature of both Richard and Martha Carter's decline, the progression, the symptoms, the timeline. He said with the precise language of a man who will not say more than the evidence supports, and will not say less, that the pattern of illness in both cases was consistent with something other than natural fever. He said he had noted this at the time, and had considered whether to report it, and had he paused here, and his voice carried in it a weight that was 7 years older than Abigail's grief, decided against it, because he had no proof, only suspicion, and had regretted that decision ever since. The chamber was very quiet. Cornelius Marsh's lead attorney objected. The judge allowed the testimony to stand. May Hollis took the stand last. She opened her diary to the relevant page with the unhurried confidence of a woman who has had 81 years to develop her relationship with time, and finds being rushed frankly beneath her dignity. She read her own entry aloud in a clear, carrying voice. The date, the location, the specific words she had overheard between Thomas Hale and Cornelius Marsh. They didn't need her cooperation. Only her signature. In the gallery, someone made a sound. May Hollis looked up from her diary, looked across the room at Cornelius Marsh with the expression of a woman who has been waiting 8 years to do exactly this, and then looked back at the judge with perfect composure. Marsh's attorneys asked for a recess. The judge granted 30 minutes. During the recess, Abigail sat in the hallway on a wooden bench with Nathan on her right and Walter on her left, and Aldred pacing in front of her, with his hands behind his back, which she had come to understand meant he was recalculating something. "How does it look?" Nathan asked him. "It looks like we have substantially more than we came in with," Aldred said without stopping his pacing. "Park's testimony alone moves the evidentiary ground significantly. May's diary entry is..." He paused. "It's extraordinary, frankly. Diaries are contemporaneous records. The date is indisputable. The content is specific." He stopped pacing. "There is one more thing." They looked at him. "Thomas Hale's absence today is not accidental," Aldred said. "I made some inquiries this morning while we were waiting. Hale was offered an arrangement by Marsh's legal team. His name removed from the primary filing, certain documents reclassified in exchange for his cooperation over the years. That arrangement, I believe, is what Marsh is now reconsidering in that recess room." He looked at Abigail. "Which means there is a possibility that Marsh's attorneys come back with an offer to concede portions of the record in exchange for limiting the scope of the findings. Meaning they admit to the fraud but try to minimize the consequences," Nathan said. "Yes. What do we do if they offer that?" Abigail asked. Aldred looked at her steadily. "That is entirely your decision," he said. "A partial concession is documented and real and creates a permanent legal record that cannot be undone. A full proceeding carries more risk and more time." Abigail was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about her father and his reputation for fair dealing and the specific dirt of a ranch she hadn't seen in 7 years. She thought about what she had told Gerald Marsh on the porch, that what she wanted was the record corrected. The truth in the official documents. What was stolen, acknowledged as stolen. "I want the full record," she said. "I want every fraudulent document entered and every forged signature identified, and everything they did put where anyone can read it for the next 100 years. She looked up at Aldred. "Can we get that?" Aldred looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was the closest thing to warmth she'd seen from him. "I believe we can," he said. "Then that's what we're doing," she said. The hearing reconvened. Marsh's attorneys did not offer a concession. They went back to their arguments, which were substantially less solid than they'd been that morning, and Aldred met each one with the particular unhurried precision of a man who is prepared for exactly this response. The judge's ruling came on the second day late afternoon in the specific slant of autumn light that makes everything look either important or final. The original transfer documentation was found to contain material misrepresentations. The debt figures were established as fraudulent. The witness signatures were found to be improperly obtained. The transfer of the Carter Ranch property in 1872 was ruled legally invalid. Cornelius Marsh sat in his chair and did not move. Abigail sat in the gallery and did not move either. Nathan's hand found hers under the edge of the table and held it, and she held it back, and neither of them said anything because there were no words available for this specific moment. The moment when 7 years of hiding and running and carrying and surviving finally arrived at something that looked from the outside like justice and felt from the inside like the first full breath she'd taken since she was 22 years old. The legal process of restoring the Carter Ranch did not happen overnight. Nothing that mattered ever did. There were further filings. There were months of documentation and surveying and record transfers. There were 2 additional hearings, smaller, procedural, less dramatic, that Aldred navigated with the same steady efficiency he brought to everything. Cornelius Marsh faced charges of fraud and document forgery. His connections protected him from the worst of the consequences, which was a specific kind of injustice that Aldred acknowledged plainly, and that Abigail accepted because she had learned through 7 hard years the difference between perfect justice and the real kind. The real kind was what you could get. It was still worth getting. Through all of it, she cooked. She tended the garden, which by November had given everything it had to give for the season, and stood in neat dormant rows, waiting for spring. She sat with Walter in the evenings and finished his wife's needlework, not her own project, but the completion of someone else's, which felt, when she set the last stitch, like a kind of prayer. She handed it to Walter when it was done, and he held it in his big work-worn hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "I would have liked her," Abigail said. He folded it carefully and set it on the table beside his chair where it stayed, where it belonged. She thought often about the Carter Ranch during those months. She had to decide what to do with it. The ruling restored her legal claim. But the property itself had been worked by other hands for 7 years under Marsh's ownership, and the question of what to do with a recovered thing was different and harder than the question of how to recover it. She rode out to see it in December, on a day when the sky was the particular white of winter, beginning in earnest. Nathan rode with her and said almost nothing for the entire 3-hour journey, which was his particular form of respect for the things she needed to feel without interference. The ranch house was still standing. It was in better repair than she expected. Marsh's people had maintained it functionally, though, without any of the particular care her parents had given it. The kitchen garden was a bare rectangle of earth. The fence lines were intact. The bones of the place were the bones she remembered. She stood outside it for a long time. Nathan stood a few feet back and let her look. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked, when the silence had gone on long enough to have said everything she needed it to say. She considered the question. She looked at the house and the fences and the bare winter earth and felt all of it, the grief of it, the history, the 20 years her father had put into the soil, the kitchen her mother had cooked in the person she had been when she'd last walked away from this place. "I'm going to sell it," she said. Nathan was quiet. "Not to Marsh," she said. "Not to Voss. To a family that will work it properly. Someone who'll put a garden back in that south corner and mean it." She turned to look at him. "I don't need it to know it was mine. I've known that for 7 years. What will you do with the money?" She looked at him steadily. "Help pay off your banknote," she said, "if you'll let me." He opened his mouth. "Don't argue about it," she said. "You saved my life. Not the dramatic way, the ordinary way, the way that matters. I'd like to do something real in return." He closed his mouth. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I'll let you, on one condition." "What condition?" He looked at her with the same steady, unhurried expression he'd had since the first day when he'd crouched down to her level at the water trough and told her that what he knew about her was already enough. "Stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper, not on a temporary arrangement. Just stay." The winter air was very still around them. "Is that a question?" she asked. "It's whatever you need it to be," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had hired her without strings, who had given her a room and a kitchen and a garden to pull weeds in, who had put his hand over hers at a table when the world cracked open, who had stood up in a church beside her and not said a single word because the standing was the word, who had crouched down to her level every single time without ever being asked. "It's a yes," she said. Spring came back to the broken spur the way it always did in that country. Not gently, not as a gradual warming, but in strong, decisive days that alternated with cold snaps that made you forget spring was coming, and then remembered you forcefully. The vegetable garden came back first, which felt right. The beans Abigail had replanted along the south wall pushed through in April, and the tomatoes she'd started in pots near the kitchen stove were transplanted in May, when the last frost risk had finally passed. Walter planted the flowers himself. He did it one morning while Abigail was in the kitchen, and Nathan was out in the pastures, and when she looked out the window and saw him crouched in the garden bed with seed packets and a small trowel, she stood at the sink for a full minute, just watching, and then very quietly went back to what she was doing. At dinner that night, she mentioned casually that the south bed would need more water if the sun stayed this strong. Walter said equally casually that he was aware of that. Nathan looked between them with the expression of a man who has learned to recognize the particular language of two people who are taking care of each other sideways, and he went back to his food without comment. Charles Aldred came back to the Broken Spur in June with final papers, the completed transfer of the Carter Ranch to a family named Holbrook, the distribution of the sale proceeds, and the last of the legal filings from the Marsh proceedings. He sat at the kitchen table and spread everything out with the efficient pleasure of a man finishing a very large and very complicated puzzle. Cornelius Marsh has been fined substantially, and his county connections have been significantly weakened by the findings, Aldred said. He won't be acquiring anyone's land for some time, possibly ever. He paused. Gerald Marsh has apparently left the territory. Nobody at the table seemed particularly distressed by this information. Aldred signed the last page and slid it across to Abigail. She signed it with her full name, Emily Carter, and then underneath, in smaller letters, Abigail Turner Brooks, because she had been all of those things, and all of them were true. Aldred looked at the signature. He almost smiled. "Both names," he said. "I earned them both," she said. The wedding had been in April Small in the parlor of the Broken Spur, with May Hollis and Pete Dugan as witnesses and Walter standing beside Nathan with the straightest spine he'd had in 3 years. Abigail had worn a dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd chosen in Cheyenne on the day they'd gone back to file the last of the legal papers, a deep blue wool that fit her exactly as she was, without apology, without alteration for anyone else's comfort. When the pastor asked if she took Nathan Brooks as her husband, she said yes, with the particular certainty of a woman who has learned the difference between what she deserves and what she'd been told she deserved, and has made her peace with the gap. Nathan had looked at her in that dress in that light, and the look had said everything that a man who speaks mostly in actions rather than words could manage to say, which was enough, more than enough, which was everything. The summer that followed was the best one Abigail could remember. The garden produced beyond what she'd projected. She taught Walter to make bread on rainy days, which he approached with the focused seriousness of a man tackling a professional challenge, and by July he was better at it than she'd expected, and quietly proud of the fact. She started taking baskets of produce to May Hollis on Thursdays, and staying for coffee, and those Thursday mornings became the kind of fixture that anchors a life regular, uncomplicated, genuinely wanted. Nathan paid off the bank note in full in August. He came home from the bank and told her in the kitchen, in a voice that was absolutely even, and had underneath it the relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for 2 years and has finally been allowed to set it down. She put her arms around him in the kitchen and held on, and he held on back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that they hadn't already said. On the first cool evening of September, she made stew. She made it the way she'd always made it, the way her mother had taught her, the way her grandmother had taught her mother, time first, and then bay beef browned longer than most people bothered with potatoes, cut thick so they didn't go to mush. She made it in the kitchen of the Broken Spur, which was her kitchen. Now the kitchen she had walked into for the first time with $11.40 and a battered suitcase, and no plan. The kitchen that smelled like someone was home. Nathan came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway and looked at the pot on the stove with an expression she knew now, not hunger, not quite, but older than hunger. The expression of a man whose kitchen smells like his mother's kitchen and has somehow also become something entirely new. "Stew," he said. "First cool evening," she said. He came and stood beside her at the stove, close enough that their arms were touching. She stirred the pot. He watched. Walter came downstairs and appeared in the kitchen doorway without his usual deliberate slowness, which meant he'd smelled it from the stairs. "I'll set the table," he said. They ate together in the kitchen, where they'd been eating together for almost a year now. The three of them at the round table near the window that looked out onto the garden. Walter poured the coffee without being asked. Nathan passed the bread he'd cut. May Hollis was coming tomorrow, and he knew Abigail would want the good loaf saved, so he'd slice the second one, which was this specific kind of small attention that she had come to recognize as his particular language of love. After dinner, Pete Dugan knocked on the door with his wife and two of their ranch hands, because Abigail had mentioned Thursday to Pete's wife, and Pete's wife had apparently mentioned it more widely. Abigail ladled stew into bowls without a word of complaint, and found enough bread and enough chairs, and the table that had been 3 people became 8 people, and the kitchen that had been quiet for years was loud, in the way that healthy things are loud. Overlapping voices. Someone laughing at something, Walter telling Pete Dugan. Something about the flower bed, in a tone that would not have been recognizable to anyone who'd known him 2 years ago. Abigail stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked at all of them. She looked at Nathan across the table, who caught her eye and held it for just a moment, that steady, unhurried look that had been consistent from the first day, that had never asked her to be smaller or quieter or different in any direction. She looked at Walter, who was gesturing with his coffee cup and talking more than he'd talked in years. She looked at the pot on the stove, still half full, warm smelling of thyme and bay, and everything her mother had taught her in a kitchen that had been taken from her and could not be returned, because you cannot return the past. But you could build something from it. You could take what was given to you and what was stolen from you, and what you had made yourself in the years between, and you could bring it to a table where people were waiting, and you could feed them, and that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the only thing that had ever mattered. Emily Carter had lost everything at 22 and survived it. She had changed her name and her county and the surface of herself and kept walking. She had arrived in Dry Creek with $11.40 and her mother's recipe and a dignity that no one had been able to take from her, no matter how many times they'd tried. She had cooked a bowl of stew in a stranger's kitchen, and a man with a sharp mind and a quiet heart had stood in the dark and asked a question that he couldn't let go of, and that question had pulled at a thread, and the thread had led back to everything, and everything had led here to this kitchen, this table, these people, this life. Some things that are lost stay lost. That is the honest truth, and Abigail had made her peace with it. But some things find their way home through the most unlikely doors, through a worn suitcase and a public humiliation and a job offer from a stranger at a water trough. And when they do, they don't look the way you expected them to look when you lost them. They look better. They look like something you built yourself from the ground up with your own hands in the full knowledge of what it cost. Home was not the Carter Ranch. Home was not a name in a legal document, or a line in a judge's ruling, or a piece of land that bore her father's history. Home was this a kitchen that smelled like someone was finally completely irrevocably in it. A man who had looked at her without flinching from the first moment and had never stopped. An old man planting flowers in a garden because the woman who'd planted them before deserved to have them continue. A table full of people who had chosen to stand. Abigail Turner Brooks stood in the kitchen of the Broken Spur on the first cool evening of September and listened to the people she loved being loud and alive in the next room, and she understood with the full and unhurried certainty of a woman who has earned the right to be certain about exactly this, that she had not survived in order to merely endure. She had survived in order to belong.